from any computer with only an internet connection and a web browser has made web applications an essential element of today's organizations. The server-side attacks, you have cross-site scripting. A cross-site scripting attack injects scripts into a web application server that will then direct attacks at the clients. It does not attempt to maliciously attack a web application server to steal the content or deface it. Instead, it uses the server as a platform to launch attacks to other computers that access it. A SQL injection or SQL injection targets SQL servers by injecting commands on those servers. SQL stands for Structured Query Language and is a language used to view and manipulate data that is stored in a relational database. By entering crafted SQL statements as user input on a SQL server that does not filter input, information from the database can be extracted or the existing data can be manipulated. XML injection. XML is a markup language. It's a method for adding annotations to text so that the additions are distinguished from the text itself. One markup language is XML, or Extensible Markup Language. XML is designed to carry data instead of indicating how to display it. An XML injection attack is similar to an SQL injection attack. An attacker who discovers a website that does not filter input can inject XML tags and data into the database. A command injection or directory traversal. The root directory is a very specific directory on a web server's file system. Users who access the server are usually restricted to this directory. Users may be able to access directories and files beneath the root directory, but they cannot access other parallel or higher level directories. A directory traversal attack takes advantage of a vulnerability in the web application program or the web server software so that a user can move from the root directory to other restricted directories. The ability to move to another directory could allow an unauthorized user to view confidential files or even enter or inject commands to execute on a server, known as command injection. Let's talk about client-side attacks. Web application attacks are considered server-side. A client-side attack targets vulnerabilities in client applications that interact with a compromised server or process malicious data. A couple of those: header manipulation. The HTTP header is part of the HTTP packet that is composed of fields, and they contain different characteristics of data being transmitted. Because HTTP headers can originate from a web browser, an attack can modify the headers, called HTTP header manipulation, and create an attack. Another way are cookies and attachments. HTTP does not have a mechanism for a website to track whether a user has previously visited the site. Any information that was entered on a previous visit, such as site preference or contents of an electronic shopping cart, is not retained on the web server. Instead, the web server asking the user for the same information each time can store user-specific information in a file on the user's local computer and then retrieve it later. This is called a cookie. There are several different types of cookies. There is a first-party cookie, which is created from the website that a user is currently viewing. A third-party cookie is a cookie that some websites attempt to place that come from third parties that advertise on their site and want to record the user's preferences. A session cookie is stored in random access memory instead of the hard drive and only lasts for the duration of the visit. A persistent cookie is the opposite of a session cookie. It is also called a tracking cookie. Persistent cookie is recorded on the hard drive of the computer and does not expire when the browser closes. A secure cookie is only used when a browser is visiting a server using a secure connection. And a flash cookie is named after the Adobe Flash Player. It is also known as a local shared object. These cookies are significantly different from regular cookies. Typically, they are saved in multiple locations on the hard drive and can take up as much as 100,000 bytes of storage per cookie. That's about 25 times the size of a normal cookie. Another type of client-side attack is session hijacking. It's important that a user who's accessing a secure web application, such as an online bookstore, can be verified so as to prevent the attacker from jumping into the interaction and ordering books that are charged to the victim but are sent to another address. This form of verification is called a session token, which is a random string assigned to that session. Session hijacking is an attack in which the attacker attempts to impersonate the user by using his session token. This attack is generally conducted in one of two ways. The first is stealing the session token, and the second is attempting to guess the session token. Another client-side attack are malicious add-ons. Add-ons themselves are programs that provide additional functionality to web browsers. One of the most widely used add-ons for Windows computers is Microsoft ActiveX technology, developed for Internet Explorer. But a malicious add-on is one that the user did not ask for or necessarily want. A lot of these come in the form of toolbars. And finally, buffer overflow attack. A buffer overflow occurs when a process attempts to store data in RAM beyond the boundaries of a fixed length storage buffer. The storage buffer contains the return address of the program to which the computer's processor should return once the new process has finished. An attacker sometimes tries to overflow the buffer with a new return address and point to another area in the data memory that contains, say, malware code instead of the proper program. Let's talk about network attacks. And of course, the first one we're going to talk about is denial of service, or DOS. A denial of service attack attempts to prevent a system from performing its normal functions. There are several types of DOS attacks. A ping flood. A ping flood attack uses the Internet Control Message Protocol, or ICMP, which is a network layer protocol that is part of Transmission Control Protocol, TCP/IP, to flood the victim with packets. A Smurf attack broadcasts a ping request to all computers on the network, but changes the address from which the request came. The impersonation of another computer or device is called spoofing. This makes it appear that the target computer is asking for a response from all the computers. So all the computers then respond to the ping that seems to come from the server that they're trying to deny service of, and it spends all its time trying to figure those out. A SYN flood, or SYN flood, takes advantage of the processes for initiating a session. Under normal network conditions using TCP/IP, a device contacts a network server with a request, such as display web page or open a file. This request uses a control message to initialize the connection, called an SYN. The server responds back with its own SYN, along with acknowledgement that it received the initial request, called a SYN-ACK. In a SYN flood attack against a web server, the attacker sends SYN segments in IP packets to the server. However, the attacker modifies the source address of each packet to addresses that do not exist or cannot be reached. The server continues to hold the line open and wait for a response, which will never come, while receiving more and more false requests and keeping more and more lines open for a response. After a short period of time, the server runs out of resources and can no longer respond to legitimate requests or even function properly. And then a final variant of the DOS attack is the distributed denial of service attack, which is DDoS. Instead of using a single computer, a DDoS attack may use hundreds or thousands of zombie computers on a botnet to flood a device with requests. This makes it virtually impossible to identify and block the source of the attack. And most DOS attacks these days are this type of attack. There are interception attacks as well. The two main interception attacks are man-in-the-middle. Man-in-the-middle attack is intercepting legitimate communication, forging a fictitious response to the sender. Man-in-the-middles can be conducted on networks. This type of attack makes it appear that two computers are communicating with each other when actually they are sending and receiving data with a computer between them, or a man in the middle. And then a replay attack. A replay attack is similar to a passive man-in-the-middle attack, whereas a passive attack sends the transmission immediately. A replay attack makes a copy of the transmission before sending it on, and then this copy is later used by replaying it. In other words, if there's a session token or information, it replays that to impersonate the original. There are poisoning attacks. ARP poisoning in particular, TCP/IP requires that logical IP addresses be assigned to every host on a network. When a computer requests and receives the IP address that relates to its specific MAC address, the IP address and the corresponding MAC address are stored in an ARP table. ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol. In addition, all other computers that hear the ARP also cache the data. An attacker in an ARP poisoning attack modifies the MAC address in the ARP cache so that the corresponding IP address in the ARP cache then points to a totally different computer. This is known as ARP poisoning. DNS poisoning works similarly. Whereas ARP poisoning substitutes a fraudulent MAC address for an IP address, DNS poisoning substitutes a fraudulent IP address for a symbolic name. So say you wanted to go to google.com and it was in your DNS cache. They poison the DNS such that it no longer points at google.com. It points at something else. And then there are attacks on access rights. These include privilege escalation. Operating systems and many applications have the ability to restrict a user's privileges to access specific functions. Privilege escalation is exploiting a vulnerability in software to gain access to resources that the user would not have originally. And transitive access is basically an attack that involves using a third party, which is trusted, to gain access rights. Attackers can exploit the confusing nature of transitive access to gain access to restricted resources. And as always, remember, keep calm and document everything.